What I wanted to do today is continue the series that we've been in, which was Faith, Let's Get Real, right? And the whole point of the series is to look at the practical application of our faith. Like, what does it really mean to live as a Jesus follower? And what I wanted to do today was address another question. And that question is, well, is it wrong to feel tempted? If he doesn't steal the cookie, he just thinks about stealing the cookie. Is that actually wrong? Is temptation itself wrong? Because we are all tempted by things, right? We all have temptations, and we all have a few things that we really struggle with, right? There's kind of no evading that, right? So I really kind of want to address two questions here this morning. One is feeling tempted, is the feeling of being tempted, is that actually wrong? And how do we deal with temptation? Because I'm going to give you a hint. No one ever reaches the point where they are not tempted. Right? We even know that Satan tempted Jesus. Right? So if he's not immune, I don't want to burst your bubble, but you're probably not immune either. Now remember that throughout this series, the primary source for everything we're talking about is the New Testament book of James. Right? As we've talked about, James was Jesus' brother. James never really believed in Jesus during Jesus' earthly ministry. In fact, the gospel authors tell us that James actually thought Jesus was out of his mind. It was only after the resurrection that James became a believer in Jesus and ultimately became a leader in the first century church. And what we see in James, or this book we call James, we know is actually a letter where it's really kind of a collection of wisdom. It kind of jumps around a little bit. And so as we go through this, we're kind of just encountering it kind of piece by piece and just talking about the things that he's talking about. And in the section we're looking at today, he talks about temptation and how we deal with that. Now, just as a reminder, as he wrote this letter, it wasn't written to a single church and it wasn't written to the entire church. It was written to a group of churches. Churches that he knew that people were dealing with very difficult situations. And remember that he actually talks about this idea of having trials. And as we talked about earlier in the series, when James talks about experiencing trials, he's actually using one word to capture kind of two ideas. That in one sense, trials are those temptations that we struggle with. And he talks about, well, you're going to have those kind of trials. In the other sense, when he says trials, that includes things that are external to us. When people are mistreating us, when things go wrong, we lose our job, those sort of things. And he covers all that under this idea of trials. And so what we want to do today is we want to look specifically at the temptation side of that and how that affects us. And so what we'll do this morning is that we'll actually see what James says about temptation, and then we'll bring in some help. We'll actually have the Apostle Paul kind of give us some more information about that, because Paul actually has some really good insights on this idea of temptation. Now, as we've looked at each week, James, knowing that people were dealing with all these trials and all these difficulties, you'd think he'd start out soft, but remember how he starts the letter. He says, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds." In other words, when it's all going wrong, be happy about it. Right? Now, of course, it sounds delusional, right? But that's not what he was saying. He says, have joy because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. And so what James wanted to lay out here is that as we go through our lives, the goal of our life is not just to have an easy life. Right? It's to live life in connection with God, in relationship with God, following where God leads us and doing the work that God calls us to. And in order to do that, we have to have a strong relationship with God. So what James is laying out here is that when you're having these struggles, don't just look at the downside. I mean, yeah, deal with it, try to get out of it, right? But also recognize that these are things that can give you joy because it can strengthen that relationship. And as we finished up last week, we kind of looked at a verse where James really kind of pushes on this idea of perseverance. Right? James said, "Blessed is the one who perseveres under trial, because having stood that test, the person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love him." Right? And the point he's making here is how we live out our faith actually matters. Right? That salvation is a gift from God, right? That through Jesus, when we put our faith in Jesus, when we trust that he is who he says he is, Well, that gives us salvation, right? That gives us eternal life, eternity with God. But James is making the point that that's not the end of it, right? That's just kind of the start, right? That once you kind of put your faith in Jesus, living out that faith actually matters. It impacts how we affect the world around us. But James is going so far as to say the nature of our eternal life depends on what we do in this phase of our life, that there's somehow a relationship. And he uses this language of having stood the test. And it's interesting that the language and the structure of how he says having stood the test, the language he's using is as if someone gave you like a gold or a silver coin and you wanted to be sure that it was real. You would test to see if it's real. Basically, what James is saying here is that having stood the test, in other words, you've shown the test that you really have put your faith in Jesus, that you're actually living that way. Having stood the test shows that you're genuine. It shows that you're really following Jesus, that it is your intent to follow Jesus, that you're going through your life as you deal with those challenges, trusting in Jesus and living out the life as we're called to. So as we pick up this week with kind of the next part of what James talks about, that's where we get into this idea of temptation. And specifically, how do we deal with our temptations? And starting out, as he kind of moves into this next verse, he addresses a misconception that I believe is common now, but was clearly common back in the first century. Because notice what he says about temptation. James says, when tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. And what he's saying is that people are actually going around saying that when they're in a situation where they are tempted to, the Bible word we use is sin. They're saying that, well, God put that opportunity to sin in front of me. He's testing me with that. And I've actually heard people say that. But remember that what is sin? Sin is anything that harms ourselves or someone else. And James is saying, don't say that God is tempting you to harm yourself. Don't say God is tempting you to harm someone else, because that's evil. So he's basically saying, don't be blaming God for what you're dealing with. Not when it comes to that sort of thing. You know, there might be other kinds of trials where we have external challenges. But when we're tempted to do something harmful to ourselves or someone else, that's not God. In fact, James basically makes the point that that can't be God, because to do that would be evil. God is not evil. God is not tempted by evil. God does not do evil. So the source of your temptation, the source of my temptation, the source of the temptation of every person who is hearing this letter, it's not God. So where does temptation come from? Well, James says, well, each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. James is using stronger language than I would use. I would have written this as, well, we're tempted when our desires kind of take us in the wrong direction, right? James is like, no, it's your evil desires, man. That's the problem, right? And I don't necessarily, I wouldn't have said it that way, but that's what he went with, right? And what he's saying is that our temptations come from the unhealthy desires inside of us, the wants that are unhealthy inside of us. And the point here is that we all have those issues, right? We all have desires inside of us, right? That we all do things that are harmful, right? Sometimes we do things that are harmful to others. Why? Well, maybe because we want more, right? We want more money. We want more stuff, so we take advantage of another person. Or maybe we do things that harm ourselves. Like maybe I just need to escape or check out, so I do some things that are harmful to myself. Maybe my emotions are overwhelming me, and I need to kind of hide from those, so I do something that's harmful to myself to kind of numb everything and to kind of disengage. Maybe sometimes the things we do can be harmful to ourselves and others, because maybe we have an unhealthy desire to be noticed or stand out. And so we do these things. And the point is that these sort of issues are inside of all of us. And then James says that it's those temptations inside of us. They're the things that lead to trouble. The temptation itself is not the problem. But then he goes on to say, but then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. And so James is saying the problem is that, okay, the temptation rises up. We all have temptation. But the problem begins when we act on the temptation, where we make a choice or take an action or do something that harms ourselves or someone else. And he's saying that when we follow through on that, he says it's death. And what he's saying is it's spiritual death. Right? And honestly, that's at the root of the gospel, right? That we all sin. We all do things that are harmful to ourselves or others. And because of that, it creates a space or a distance between us and God. And we need to have that resolved. And that is the gospel, that Jesus closes that gap for us. That when we put our faith in Jesus, he gives us new life. That our own temptations that lead to actions and follow through separate us from God. But when our faith is in Jesus, we're recovered from that. And we're back in connection with Jesus and with God, and that gives us life. So that leads to an important question. That if all sin, in other words, if all kind of harmful behavior that we call sin in Bible terms, if it starts with temptation, the way to address it is to deal with your temptation. So how do we deal with our temptations? Like, what do we do to kind of just address that issue? And this is where the Apostle Paul can give us some really strong help on this. The Apostle Paul has just a couple verses here in a separate letter called 1 Corinthians that really address this issue of dealing with our temptations. So if we look what Paul says, as he's talking about temptation, he says, so if you think you're standing firm, be careful you don't fall. What is he saying? That minute you think you got it, that is when you are most at danger. You know, that even when things are going well, you know, it's that, my faith is in Jesus and things are going well, or maybe I've kind of been working a program and things are going well. The minute you think you got it, that's when you fall. And the thing I find interesting is that this is just a fact of life, like not just temptation. All kinds of things work that way. You know, I remember when I got my first dirt bike when I was 9 years old, right? My mother didn't like the idea. My father loved the idea. Right? And so it's a real dirt bike, has a clutch, it has gears, it has all these things, right? And so I'm out riding, and I'm riding this trail system I rode all the time. And, at first I was kind of slow, and I was kind of struggling with it. And I was getting better at riding because I was riding a lot. My dad literally said to me some version of, be careful. The minute you think you got it, that's when it's going to bite you. And I swear he spoke that into my life. Because like the next day I'm out riding, and I'm riding through the trail, and it's a really tight spot where I kind of could never keep the speed up I wanted. And I finally did it. I finally kept the speed, made the turn. And in my happiness with myself, instead of staying down on the bike, I sat up, branched across the neck, off the back of the bike, and onto the ground. Why? I thought I had it. I stopped being on guard. I stopped watching for the situations that I knew could take me down. Well, that's temptation. You know what your biggest temptations are. I know what mine are. And if I don't stay on guard for them, that is when I am most at risk. Now, talking about temptation, Paul goes on to say that no temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind. And this is really important. And what Paul is saying here is that temptation in life is unavoidable. Right? Christian or not, we're all going to have temptation. And what's really important about that is he's making it clear that temptation itself is not wrong. Right? That we all will have that. It's not the fact that we experience temptation that's wrong. I mean, we should take practices that kind of minimize that if we can. But the problem is the follow-through. So if the temptation itself isn't wrong, and Paul is telling us, and I think we all know this, we're all having it, we're all going to have it, it's never all going to go away. What we want to do is we want to understand, how do we deal with our temptation? And so Paul tells us something really important. He tells us that when we're dealing with temptation, that we're not alone. Paul says, God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted, he will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. And next thing is so important. When you are tempted, God will also provide a way out so that you can endure it. The thing here is that God never promises that you won't face temptations. Right? God never promises you or me that whatever we wrestle with, that we will just be kept safe from it all the time. that he says we will have it. But he provides an opportunity to break out of it before it turns into action. But if that's going to work, then it means we need to kind of follow a process, right? That we want to be in connection with God, right? We want to be praying to God. We want to be looking to God. And there's a reality, right? Then when we experience temptation, maybe we just pause for a minute and call out to God. Because I recognize that for some of us, there are some temptations that are really, really difficult. We can have lots of small ones, but there are a few for all of us. Not the same for all of us, but we all have them. And what we're saying here is that when you're in that situation, you know when you're experiencing temptation, just pause before you act and call out to God. And he will give you a way out. He will open an exit. And if we think about our own lives, I think we all know this is true, right? Think about the last time you did something that you really regretted. Was there a moment where you could have changed direction? Was there a moment where you could have done something different, but you made the decision to do it anyway? That I made the decision to do it anyway. Right? We could have stepped away, but we actually chose not to. I know my life is filled with those moments. That we don't think about this act of committing a sin, this act of kind of doing something that's harmful. That we kind of pretend like we fall into it. But the reality is that we do make that decision. Right? But the thing is, there's no way to completely avoid temptation, right? But what we have to do is that we have to reach out to him. Right? Because think about your own life, right? That if you're sitting there and you're about to say something horrible to somebody, could you have just walked away? If there's a dependency you have, could you have kind of not, gone in there? How about that browser that's open and you're about to click that link? Could you have just closed it? Or when you're holding your phone and you're about to send a text or a DM to somebody where you're going to really flame up on them, could you have just put it down? Right? Those are the things that we need to do. That God will always give us an exit. But something that's important to remember, that God might give you that exit before you actually find yourself in that situation. Right? That we know that there are circumstances and scenarios that can lead us to do things that we'd rather not do, or at least put us at higher risk of it. That when you have that idea, if you're struggling with alcohol, the easy one, right? You walk up to the bar. Maybe you go home that day. We can make fun of that, but people struggle with those sort of things all the time. Right? I think about when I was thinking about that, like, imagine that I struggled with sweets. Thankfully, I do not. But if I did struggle with sweets, and I go to my doctor one day, and my doctor's like, hey, Jim, you're getting older. You're in your 60s now. You keep eating like that, you're going to become diabetic. And diabetic is a lifelong condition. Do you really want to do that? And I go, but when I drive home from work, that bakery's right there. I have to stop, right? And the doctor's like, well, couldn't you take another way home? I'm like, well, that would be a longer drive. That would be ridiculous. How stupid does that sound? I'm kidding, right? Let me try that again. That would be a longer drive. That would be ridiculous. Right? You wouldn't go an extra tenth of a mile to like not die from, overeating sugar? Wow, I got to do a whole nother message series here. Come on, right? The point is that we're all struggling with something and we have to make adjustments. Right? That sometimes the best solution for what you're struggling with is avoiding it in the first place. But there's also something else that's really important to consider. Avoidance is not a long-term solution. Right? If I was so connected to, desserts and sweet foods that I'm literally willing to put my life at risk to have a donut, there might be something else going on inside of me that drives me to that. Right? If I'm willing to put my life at risk by having a drink, having risky behavior, put my marriage at risk by overspending. Right? If those things are happening, there's something going on inside of us. See, the mistake is to think that the temptation itself is the problem. Right? Yes, we all will have temptation, and we have to deal with those temptations, but we also have to recognize those temptations rise up inside of us for some reason. And we all have propensities to do things at times that are not healthy, that are not helpful, that will put something important in danger. If that is going on inside of us, we need to understand that. We need to look at that and address that issue. We all experience temptation, but those most dangerous temptations that we have may require more work. And the process is the same no matter what it is you struggle with, no matter what it is I struggle with. And we all got something. It might actually be food. It might be alcohol. It might be drugs, even prescription ones. It could be pornography. It could be handling of money, shopping. And money is a funny one too, right? Because money can be unhealthy in both directions. Overspending is unhealthy. Fearfully never spending is not healthy either. And sometimes it's less tangible. Sometimes it's need for approval, need for attention, need to be in control, need to be the one who always gets credit, right? All of these things rise up out of us because something is going on inside of us. And we need to look at that, and we need to address that. And a big part of that is our relationship with God and reaching out to God in these situations. But also understand that some of our biggest challenges are not meant to be faced alone. Right? There are lots of programs out there. Whatever you're dealing with, there's a program for it. Don't be afraid to go there. Right? That we don't want to try to go it alone. We want to do it hand in hand with God. But God has built us to connect to one another. So we can lean on each other and find other people who are working through the same sort of things, or ideally who have worked through the same sort of things. That's what we want to do, is that we kind of want to walk this thing back, that we tend to look at this sin as just this kind of outcome, right? These harmful things we do to ourselves or others. And we feel like it just kind of shows up. But one of the things that James is showing us is that we have to kind of walk backwards. Get back to the temptation. When the temptation arises, address it. And when your temptations are seriously unhealthy, we need to go even further back to address their source. And as I finish up, I want to look at just a couple more things that James says here. So heading back to James and what he says about temptation. James is clearly kind of frustrated with this idea that people are blaming God for when they're tempted to sin. And so basically, James is like, don't be deceived, my dear brothers and sisters. Don't fall for that. And what he wants them to understand is that God is in this with them, right? That God is active in your life and God is doing something. But what he wants them to understand is that God is the solution here, not the source. Because James goes on to say that every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like a shifting shadow. So James is saying that God is not the cause of our temptation. He's the cause of the good things in our life, of the healthy things in our lives. And he makes this point of saying that God is the Father of the heavenly lights, right? He doesn't change like a shifting shadow. He's saying that is who God is, that God is the source of light. God is the source of goodness. And God doesn't change because shadows react to the light. God is the light, that we can trust him and that we can lean on him because he is unchanging. And if we do that, we are transformed. And the whole kind of point of all this is that as we live out our faith, we should actually do that. Live out our faith. Look at what Jesus teaches us. Live that out. Apply that. And do something with it so that it affects our lives and others. Because the last thing James says in this section is this. God chose to give us birth through the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of all he created. And what he's saying is that when we receive renewed life in Jesus, and initially he's actually writing this to some of the first generations of believers, so they're kind of the very first fruits. Right? But what he's basically saying is that each one who becomes a believer in Jesus is intended to help other people become a believer in Jesus. And so the point that James is making here is that God is at work in our lives, and through his truth, through his salvation, if we embrace the gifts he's given us, if we actually do that work to resist our temptations by leaning on God and following him as he leads us out, It enriches our lives, makes our life more full. But understand it's about more than just our lives, that what we do can impact other lives, that your transformation from who you are to who you become can help someone else find that transformation. That we are called to live out fully in Christ, to embrace the freedom he gives us, to live out our lives meaningfully through our entire lives, and living lives that point people towards Christ, point people towards freedom. That's what James wants us to see here, that in this journey of temptation, it is truly a journey of being a chance to grow closer to God and understanding that in that journey, what you do matters. It matters for you. It matters for the people whose lives you intersect with and what you can do in those lives.